good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. It's a pleasure to have you all join us today as we look at the effects of armed conflicts on resource mobilization in Burkina Faso. My name is Mabel Shu. I work with the West Africa Civil Society Institute, and it's an honor to be your host today. So again, there's the interpretation button at the bottom of the page. It looks like a globe. Kindly click on the button and choose your preferred language. So as I mentioned, we'll be looking at the effects of armed conflicts in Burkina Faso. And when we look at the West Africa region, we realize that recently West Africa has experienced some level of instability and insecurity in the forms of political upheavals. We've had both successful and failed coups. We've had armed conflicts as well as jihadist insurgencies. So we look at countries like Nigeria, Senegal, Sierra Leone, and recently Togo that have witnessed political instability as a result of elections. When we look at the Sahel region, we have countries like Niger, Guinea, Mali, and Burkina Faso, where coups are gradually becoming a norm. So analysis have shown that between 2018 and 2023, 15 out of the 16 West African countries experienced an increase in the annual number of conflicts. The effectiveness of civilian governments in some countries in dealing with the insurgencies and the conflicts has been used as an excuse by most of the military to seize and take over power in most countries, especially around West and Central Africa. So when we look at all these countries, despite the fact that their contexts are unique, there's an overall trend when it comes to democratic decline, when it comes to instability and closing civic space. These cut across the entire West African region and even across Africa as a whole. So when it comes to Burkina Faso, we realize that Burkina Faso is gradually becoming the epicenter in terms of violent extremism, in terms of armed conflicts in the Sahel region. And according to the Civicus Monitor, the civic space in Burkina Faso is now obstructed, and I'm very sure we understand why. In terms of coups in Africa, Burkina Faso is leading, according to Voice of Africa, Burkina Faso is leading when it comes to successful coups. So far, Burkina Faso has had 9 successful coups out of the 10 attempted. The first was Sudan with 15 attempted coups, and Burkina Faso is leading with 9 successful coups. And out of these 9, we had 2 of them that took place in 2022. So this is already a very worrying trend. And in the past 7 years, that's from 2016, conflict-related violence has displaced over 2 million people in Burkina Faso and has left over 6 million people depending on humanitarian aid. And we know that most of this humanitarian aid comes from international organizations and goes through NGOs and CSOs within the country. But the challenge now is that due to the instability in Burkina Faso, there's been some form of withdrawal in terms of funding towards humanitarian causes. And CSOs are now struggling to raise funds to be able to meet up with their mandates. So the question is, what are some alternative methods that civil society organizations could use to raise funds? So some organizations have leveraged local fundraising. Some of them are using resource mobilization to be able to raise funds to still cater for their needs. So looking at the challenges that come around with the instability and insecurity, we are looking at some of the effects that these armed conflicts have had on the ability of civil society organizations to mobilize resources, and would also be analyzing the strategies that some of them have put in place to be able to effectively raise funds. And just before we go into that, it would be nice to at least have an idea of some of the challenges that we, both as individuals and as organizations, are facing when it comes to effective resource mobilization. So my colleague would be sharing a link in the chat section. It's a Mentimeter link. So please just click on the link and share with us some of the challenges or factors that affect resource mobilization, or some of the challenges you think organizations have to go through in terms of resource mobilization. So I'm waiting for the responses. In a few words, just tell us, what are some of the challenges that civil society organizations face when raising resources or when mobilizing resources? I don't see the responses coming in. Please, can we click on the link and just share? What are some of the challenges civil society organizations face when mobilizing resources? Please, do we all have access to the link? If you can't have access to the link, you can just write in the chat and we would read. Patrick, please kindly paste the link again. Some people say they can't see the link. Okay, somebody says late responses from sponsors. Thank you very much. The link has been posted again. Please, do we all have access to the link? Kindly just check again. Okay, but if you don't have access to the link, kindly just post in the chat section and I'll read them. Okay. Patrick, can you post just the link? I think some people are having challenges. Oh, somebody says mis-embezzlement. Okay, so we have late responses from sponsors. We have mis-embezzlement. All right, the link has been posted again. Please kindly check if you have access to the link. But if we don't have access to the link, we can always just put in our responses. We can go back to that later. Okay, so like I mentioned before, today we'll be looking at the effects of armed conflict on resource mobilization in Burkina Faso. And for our presentation today, we have Rashad Bani Samari. Rashad would be presenting to us his key findings after carrying out some research on this issue. Rashad is currently the Senior Regional Associate for Africa at the Worldwide Initiative for Grants Maker Support, that's WINGS, and is an African Graduate Fellow at the American University of Cairo. As part of his studies, he conducted several research and policy analysis, particularly on climate change and its impact on livelihoods and poverty. He is an alumnus of the 2023 West Africa Civil Society Institute Research Fellowship, where he was able to carry out this research. And Rashad believes that the continent's growth potential can be unleashed only when citizens are empowered to take charge of their destiny and create a brighter future for upcoming generations. Rashad, if you are there, please, you have the floor.
Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everyone. I hope everyone is doing fantastic. I'm now sharing my screen. I'm really happy to be here and to interact with you all on this research work. I'm very much passionate about it, and I believe that the session should be as interactive as possible. So the session has been designed such that we are all able to interact and discuss as much as possible in order to be able to better understand this issue and to dig deeper and getting much more knowledge. So as indicated by Mabel, I need to minimize this. Okay, so as indicated by Mabel, I'm going to make this presentation on the effects of armed conflict on financial resource mobilization among non-governmental organizations in Burkina Faso. The presentation would be divided in 4 main parts. So first, I'm going to lay the study background and discussing what informed my curiosity and my desire of wanting to pursue this research. Then we'll move into the study methodology, how we collected the data, and how also the data was analyzed Then I would dive into the main findings on armed conflict and financial resource mobilization, and then armed conflict and funding, then NGOs adaptation mechanisms. Then we'll move into the key recommendations. After discussing the main challenges, we'll have a pause to interact much more with all of you on the different issues raised. Then we'll move on. And I'm sure Mabel will do fantastic in steering that conversation. And I'm looking forward to having a really interactive session. So, the study background, a complex socio-political context. Burkina Faso is currently, or as of 2022, the second most affected country in terms of armed conflicts worldwide after Afghanistan. In 2022, the number of deaths increased from 759 to 1,135. And the context has become very difficult socially because now Burkina Faso is the epicenter of a humanitarian crisis with about 2 million people who are internally displaced. However, civil society organizations have been playing a key role historically. Civil society organizations were there to fight slave trade. They were there for independence and the different movements that led to independence. Now they are there and they are fighting issues related to fostering democratic governance, transparency, good governance, and also trying to foster social progress. Now, different studies have told us that civil society organizations and NGOs are affected by their context. And so recently, we've realized that there are emerging issues which do affect civil society organizations. And one of the key issues which have been identified is that civil society organizations are often dependent on international funding. So, since context affect civil society organizations and also affect NGOs, there is an issue in trying to understand how armed conflict as an evolving stressor, as an evolving context, affects NGOs in a country. And so in Burkina Faso, the first question I ask myself is, in what ways do armed conflict affect international funding to NGOs in Burkina? Secondly, I'm trying to understand in what ways armed conflict affect local funding. So first, I look at international funding, and then I move downwards at the micro perspective into local funding. And then thirdly, I want to understand if there is an effect of armed conflict on international and local funding to NGOs in Burkina Faso, how do these NGOs react? What are their adaptation mechanisms to be agile in the face of these various effects? Now, the study methodology, in order to be able to mine, capture data, and be able to better understand the context, first, I adopt a mixed method. So I have a quantitative approach and a qualitative approach. The quantitative approach is based on a survey. So I recorded 77 respondents from a pool of 268 NGOs registered at the SPONG, which is the national organization that gathers NGOs in Burkina Faso. So NGOs do register to the SPONG. And so we developed a survey which was participatory. So I engaged key stakeholders on the ground in order to be able to better understand the context in developing the survey. And then I tested the survey, which means that at the first level, I shared the survey with key actors to be able to respond, and were able to see the responses, how they responded, if the survey was accessible or not, and if there were key things to change. And we changed things in the survey to adapt it to the context in Burkina Faso. The survey targeted top-level officials such as managers, presidents of organizations, program officers, and etc. And in total, we recorded 77 respondents in the survey. Now, there was also a qualitative approach. In the qualitative approach, I recorded 11 interviews with high-level officials. So first, I developed an interview guide. We recorded the interviews, we transcribed them, and then we coded the data based on the different themes that were arising. So some of the key interviewees included presidents of organizations, program coordinators, program officers, executive secretaries, technical advisors, and humanitarian program coordinator. So another data source was secondary data. I analyzed data from the Ministry of Economics, Finance and Development in Burkina Faso, which produces annual reports on international funding to Burkina Faso from 2001 to 2021. And so I have the 20 years data set here. I also was able to collect data on conflict from the ACLED dashboard. ACLED records conflict frequency in Burkina Faso and different other countries. So this allowed me to be able to better conceptualize conflict, to understand the frequency of conflict in Burkina Faso from a specific year to the other. If you read the report, which I invite you to do, you will discover a better conceptualization of conflict in that report. So in terms of key findings, first, there is armed conflict and international funding. So the first approach is to look at how armed conflict is affecting international funding to NGOs in Burkina Faso. First, I did a year-on-year comparison in terms of understanding funding flows in the country. And we would realize that from 2009 to 2016, then to 2018, and then upward to 2021, we realized that there seemed to be an upward increment in funding from the green lights. And so this chart shows first in orange, the number of organizations that are receiving funding, and then in blue, the organizations that are, the amount of funding that is coming year on year based on reports in Burkina Faso. So then I try to understand what is the average funding organizations are receiving. And the picture here is different. This combo chart indicates that on average, funding is actually not increasing like the previous figure shows us, but funding is being seesawed. So there's an up and downward trend. But much more particularly in the green line, in the green bars of the chart, I realized that the first year from 2015 to 2016, when conflict frequency is low, funding did increase. But in 2017, when the green bar is increasing, which shows that when conflicts are increasing, upward, the blue line decreases. So it shows that on average, funding is decreasing in 2017 and 2018 as the number of conflicts do increase. Now, in 2019, 2020, we see that funding did increase and also the frequency of conflict did increase. Later on, we would explain this variation, but I got curious to understand, okay, what happened in 2016, 2017, and 2018? Why is it that there seem to be a certain link or a certain correlation? Because as conflict is increasing in 2016, 17, and 18, they seem that funding is decreasing. So I move further through the survey data to try to understand. First of all, are organizations recording a decrease in terms of funding? In the survey, 16% of organizations said no, their funding are not decreasing. But 83% of organizations told me that yes, their funding is decreasing. So I got much more curious. And then we continued digging to understand which organizations are recording decrease in funding and which organizations are recording an increment in funding. But first, I tried to match a year-on-year comparison of those survey respondents' perspectives. And I see that in 2015, the deep blue indicates the organizations that recorded an increase in funding, but the light blue indicates organizations that recorded a decrease in their funding. And in 2016, then 2016, 2015, 2016, 2017, and 18, I see that there is a certain average in terms of the organizations that recorded a reduction of funding. It did stabilize in 2017, 18, and 19. However, the deep blue is not stable. It is varying. But when you move to 2020, 2021, 2022, and 2023, the number of organizations that recorded a decrease in their funding, international funding flows in Burkina Faso have increased dramatically. So I got much more curious again in my survey to try to understand through a chart what this looks like. So I asked organizations and I tried to merge this in a combo chart. And I see that again in 2015, when conflict is low, we have low funding. Funding did increase in 2016, again, as indicated earlier. But in 2017, funding decreased. However, the frequency of armed conflicts increased. In 2018, as the frequency of armed conflict increased, funding decreased again. Now, in 2019 and 2020, we see an increment and a stabilization. However, in 2021, 2022, and 2023, we see that as armed conflict is increasing upward, the frequency or the amount of funding is decreasing per organization year on year. So this shows that as we have a certain a set of correlation, because we see that from 2015 to 2023, we have a certain trend. And this trend shows me that as we have conflicts that are increasing, funding is decreasing per organization. But funding is not totally decreasing, which means that there are some organizations that are able to access funding and some organizations who are recording a decrease in terms of funding. So I go deeper and try to understand if funding is really decreasing. And in the first case study, an organization during an interview told me that first they received funding of 250,000 euros for a project. However, when the area in which they were working was marked red, and usually countries mark areas red because there's a high prevalence of conflict in that area. When this happened, this organization lost 150,000 euros in funding. So this case study tried to tell me that, yes, indeed, there's a certain correlation, a direct correlation between conflict and funding. And this organization's experience tells us that once an area started becoming red, and once conflict started increasing in a specific area, that organization lost funding. Now, if you read the report, which I invite you again to do, there are actually much more other case studies. This is only one of them. There are other case studies which are able to link directly the occurrence of conflict and loss in funding. Now, I try to understand, okay, if funding is decreasing like organizations do tell me now, through surveys and through the interviews, why is that so? Now, the first reason is that you have a humanitarian context which has changed. And during the interviews, organizations told me that now in Burkina Faso, everything is about the humanitarian context. And so if you're an NGO who is working on development issues, you will see your funding decrease. Now, another bit is about the on-site monitoring and evaluation and security policies. Now, some organizations told me that INGOs in Burkina Faso must conduct field visits to do their monitoring and evaluation. However, because of the conflict situation, they are not able to come on site. And since they are not able to come on site, they cannot fund them anymore. So here we see that first, international funding is decreasing from the survey data and from the case studies. Now, to know why it is decreasing, we have this humanitarian context that is in, we have these on-site monitoring and evaluations that are in, and we have the security policies that are also now affecting these fundings. Now, when we move forward to try and understand local funding, because the first layer of the study is looking at international funding, but in terms of local funding, you have donations from citizens. And I try to understand first, if donations, financial donations from citizens are increasing or decreasing. And we see that, yes, it is. From 2015 to 2017, we have a certain stability in terms of donations from citizens. However, the donations from citizens decreased. So the light blue is indicating the number of organizations that saw a decrease in donations from citizens. So we see that these number of organizations are increasing up to 2023. And we know that up to 2023, the number of armed conflict is also increasing. So the number of organizations which saw decrease in funding from citizens, donations from citizens, is increasing rather than decreasing. And so I moved downward to try and understand why. And so one of the case studies tell me that even the private sector cannot fund anymore. So one case study tells me that in 2013, 2014, and 2015, they were able to spontaneously mobilize funding. However, in 2021, they contacted 10 major private companies in Burkina Faso, but only one was able to help them, mainly because of the armed conflict situation. So first, we're able to link international funding to armed conflict and decrease international funding. And we understand why this is happening. Now, we come locally to try and understand also what is happening. And we see that locally also, the number of organizations who have seen that their funding is decreasing is increasing as armed conflicts are increasing. And now we see that locally, the private sector also is struggling to fund NGOs because of armed conflicts. Now, there are more case studies in the report, of course. So I'll move to the adaptation mechanisms. So how are organizations adapting to this? What are the agile adaptation mechanisms NGOs have developed in Burkina Faso to be able to survive and thrive? Now, first of all, some of these NGOs are shifting their focus areas. So one organization told me that at the beginning when they were created, and this specific one was created in 2001, when they were created, they used to work on health and education. But now, since the conflict situation has erupted, they have changed. They are now working a little bit more on the humanitarian sector. Now, another organization told me that they are recording what is called now NGO prostitution, which means that NGOs are now focusing not on their focus area, but on emerging issues such as the humanitarian situation, such as armed conflict and health, and etc. Now, another adaptation mechanism, and of course, if you read the report, there are other adaptation mechanisms which are discussed, is hybrid funding. So organizations are able to leverage on a little bit of international funding and also generate resources locally. So there's this organization that told me that they try to build a meeting space, meeting room for participants, and that every year now they are able to mobilize 5,000 USD in terms of funding. So they are able to merge the local funding that they are able to generate by themselves with the international funding, and this allows them to be able to stay afloat. So in our report, I'm calling this hybrid funding. And of course, there are more cases in the report. Now, some other organizations are leveraging on social media. So one organization indicated that through social media, they are able to connect with the diaspora, and people are able to contact them and are able to send them resources locally. So they are able to mobilize funding from Europe, from Canada, and etc. Now, another strategy is through dinner and crowdfunding. NGOs now in Burkina Faso are able to invite key actors in order to be able to mobilize funding. So they invite actors, they cook a meal, they generate a topic for discussion. Those actors, private sector individuals, citizens, and etc., they discuss different issues. And after the discussion, they raise the local issues to which they are confronted to, and people donate. And there is one organization that was able to do that very much successfully, and there was a time they were able to mobilize about 4,400 USD in a day, which shows a certain level of prowess in mobilizing local funding. So in a nutshell, as I've said so far up to now, we have a situation of conflict which is affecting both international funding streams and local funding streams. We know now some of the main reasons why we are recording these effects. And now NGOs have developed or put in place agile adaptation mechanisms, some of which include crowdfunding, dinner and crowdfunding, some of which include hybrid funding, some of which also include a slight shift in terms of their focus area in order to be able to capture more resources locally. So now we'll move to an open floor discussion where we are able to dive much more deeper into these issues, and I'll give the floor to Mabel to steer this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rashad Bani, for that amazing presentation. And like Rashad mentioned, we are going to open the floor for discussions around this topic. I just want to highlight a couple of things that I picked out. When we were looking at the challenges that some organizations faced, I remember people mentioned misappropriation of funds, looking at competition and demands from both state and non-state actors, looking at the political instability and shifting donor priorities. And the interesting thing that you mentioned was the fact that based on the international aspect, organizations are now moving away from their core mandates, which means that somebody call it the NGO prostitution. We call it here the SDG dance. So because of the need for funding, organizations are now changing their core activities because now the humanitarian aspect is overshadowing the development sector. So it looks like most organizations in Burkina Faso are now shifting towards humanitarian acts rather than focusing on development. And looking at the adaptation mechanisms, you already mentioned it, like a shift in focus areas. They're looking at hybrid funding and leveraging social media. So we want to open the floor for discussion so that people can share with us what are some of the challenges they are facing when it comes to resource mobilization. And maybe if you have a case study, you can also just share with us. The objective here is that we can also learn from each other and see what aspects we can leverage to ensure sustainability of our own organizations. So it's time for discussion. Just share with us if there are any clarifications you would want to need, you need based on Rashad's presentation. Now is the moment. If you have any questions, please bombard Rashad with questions. You can see the energy that he has. I'm very sure that he's willing to respond to those questions. So I would start with Charles. Charles, please, you can go ahead. You have the floor.
Thanks so much, Rashad, and thank you so much, Mabel. That's a very interesting research. Thank you so much, Rashad. I learned a lot. I just wanted to ask, when it comes to the local funding, there's always a lot of money that's mobilized that may not be in cash, maybe like in kind. And in our communities, in kind tends to be a very good resource for supporting a lot of the activity. I was just wondering, when you were talking to the various organizations, did they give examples of in-kind support? Were they able to quantify it? And the ratio between the cash support and the in-kind support, I mean, can you just give us some highlights on that? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Charles. Rashad, please, you can go ahead and respond to that while we are waiting for others to come in with their questions or clarifications or whatever it is they want us to talk about.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Charles, for this question, which is really an interesting one. So when conducting the research, we also try to capture in-kind donations, such as volunteering or availing of a space to use for free, or for example, when citizens donate food, clothing, or even spaces for the humanitarian situation. Some organizations are able to quantify it. How do they do that? Is through an understanding of how much they would have spent to acquire what they had acquired. So, for example, an organization would have a free meeting space, and they were able to understand that, okay, if they had not had this free meeting space, they might have spent 500 USD for this meeting space. Or an organization may be given a free space to work or an office space to work. And so they are able to understand that if they had not had this office space to work, they would have been paying this amount of money. So at the first level, yes, some organizations are really able to quantify this, and these are mostly for the most structured organizations. Now, you would see that in the chart, not all organizations recorded a reduction in their funding. And even in the local resource mobilization, Still, while a lot of organizations recorded that their local resource mobilization was decreasing, not all of them recorded this decrease. And so some organizations, really those who are very structured, can quantify it, can understand it, and can infuse that into their answers in the surveys and also in the interviews. But there's an interesting dynamics in Burkina Faso, which is not captured by NGOs, is that there are also a lot of donations that go to the government directly. And so when citizens want, for example, to intervene in a certain area or support different actions, they directly send resources to the government. The government has also put in place a system where they're able to mobilize resources from salaries or key donations, such things. And so although there may be massive resources financially also towards a certain situation, it goes to the government. And so NGOs are not able to capitalize on that side of the resource. I hope I answered the question. My answer was too layered. I hope it was very clear. And yeah, I love questions, and let's have as much questions as possible before moving into the other layer of the discussion.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Rashad. Charles, I hope Rashad was able to answer your question. And okay, great. So my colleague would be sharing the link to the reports in the chat section. Remember, Rashad mentioned it a couple of times. More information can be found in the reports. More information can be found in the reports. So my colleague will be sharing, Patrick would be sharing the link to the reports in the chat section. We can all just take some time to go through and get more information on some of the points he mentioned. Tammy says, I lead Priority Sustainable Program at New Lines Institute in Washington, D.C. And he's encouraging NGOs to build and strengthen their LinkedIn profiles. Post about your project's mission statements. This is the primary platform policymakers and practitioners operate on, rather than on Facebook. So he's encouraging organizations to sell themselves on LinkedIn. Use LinkedIn as your airspace and post on the work you're doing. Leverage LinkedIn. Rashad also mentioned it that some organizations were leveraging social media. So Tammy is just supporting this. Okay, now I see the hands coming up. I'll start with Samuel. Samuel Modo. Please, you have the floor.
All right, thank you. Good morning to all of us.
Good morning.
My question is not directly related to funding, but then it's something I'm just curious to know. There've been reports that the government, or should I say the junta, has given some guns or arms to civilians to guide themselves against this militant groups, Al-Shabaab and the rest. I don't know how true this assertion is. And if that is true, I want to know how would, in case they go back to civilian rule, how are they able to, disarm these civilians? And what I'm also hearing is that these civilians are not trained, but then due to the inability of the previous government to deal with the security situation, locals have been given arms to guide themselves. And I'm just imagining how, if it is true, how they'll be able to disarm them when the junta gives a chance to civilian rule. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Samuel. I think this is a tricky one. I don't know if Rashad would want to respond to it, but I also want to encourage us that when we are looking out for information, it's usually advisable not to base it on I hear say, because there is this issue of misinformation and disinformation that's also causing a lot of conflicts even amongst ourselves. But I don't know, Rashad, would you want to take that? Because he said it's not really a direct question, but it's more of a worry. So in the case that this is true, what happens?
Of course, Samuel, thank you so much for your question. Although it's not really within the scope of this research, having worked in Burkina Faso for the past 5 years, and I know that there is what is known as VDP, which is a voluntary movement, volontaire pour la défense de la patrie, so volunteers to defend the country. And so these individuals are trained, they are given arms too, they are supervised by the military, and they are often guided by the military. It is done in a very structured manner, as far as I know, and based on information that I have. So it's very structured, it's well organized, they are trained. Of course, there may be situations where, of course, we don't know all the details, but from what we are aware of, they are trained, they are organized by the government, and they are given arms too. Now, on demilitarization, I may not have answers to that, which I'm not privy to these informations. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Rashad. Again, for those of us who are just joining us, we are discussing the effects of armed conflicts on resource mobilization in Burkina Faso, and we have currently opened the floor for discussions, for contributions, for questions and answers based on a research report that was presented by Rashad. And we are looking at some of the stories that people are sharing based on their experiences. So if you have any contributions to make, if you have any questions to ask, you can go ahead and ask them now. My colleague has also shared the link to the reports in the chat section. We can all go ahead and access it. Serge Dali, I see your hand up. Please, you can go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you very much for giving me the floor. First of all, I would like to thank Rashad for such a very insightful presentation. And then I have a twofold question for Rashad. First of all, I know this report is particularly focusing on Burkina Faso, but because WACC is sort of a regional organization, does he think that the findings of his research can also apply to other countries such as Mali or Burkina, and to an extent his own country, Benin, because we know that now Benin is also, forgive me to say, prone to some terrorist attacks. And so does he think that there is an impact on resource mobilization in Benin and other countries such as Mali and Niger? And the second part of my question is more of a digression because it's not really related to resource mobilization. I know that in the past, Rashad also was at WACC under the program that WACC has to mentor young professionals. Does he think that the program really had an impact on how maybe he moved from being a translation person to now being focusing more on wider issues of development? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Serge. Just as a follow-up to the first question around whether some of these mechanisms can be used in other countries, there's also a question in the chat section that says, we are based in Sudan where war is ongoing. What kind of help can you afford to our NGOs? So I think, Rashad, when you're providing your response, you might also want to just tackle this. I know that the help might not necessarily be direct, but it's just some of the forms that other organizations can use in their various countries to tackle the resource mobilization issue.
Yeah, thank you so much, Serge Dali, for the question. Number one, I don't think that these findings are applicable to Mali and Niger. It's not possible. The contexts are completely different from one country to the other. One of the key reasons why I chose Burkina Faso was the limited state intervention at the time of the conflict within the funding landscape to organizations. In Mali, already, the state was heavily involved in affecting the foreign policy, which affected funding streams, particularly from France. And so here in Mali, I wouldn't be able to quantify this situation from a plain perspective. in Burkina Faso, before this or during this research, the state still had limited effect on the funding streams. Although there were already some effect, it was limited. And so these findings are not applicable to Mali and wouldn't be also applicable to Niger. Each of them have a very peculiar context in terms of foreign policy, in terms of funding allocations, and in terms of the various dynamics. Now, the second question is related to NGOs in Benin. In the report, one of the key reasons to why we've recorded this reduction in funding to NGOs is, number one, the shift in focus areas. The situation has to be as serious, such as it forces international donors, INGOs, to shift their focus areas. Currently, I'm not sure Benin is at that level yet, where the context is so serious that it forces international donors in changing their focus areas, and to the point that it forces NGOs to shift their focus areas also in terms of their interventions on the ground. So first question, no, these findings are peculiar to Burkina Faso based on the context, not applicable to Niger or Mali. Number two, also no, this situation wouldn't be able to apply as at the moment to Benin, because in Benin, I understand the insecurity is much more to border towns with Burkina Faso, Nigeria, and Niger. And so there are sporadic issues which have not yet led towards these shifts recorded in Burkina Faso. The other question on my stay at WATSI, I don't know. Yeah, I would say it has an impact. It had an impact because it made me reconnect with another personality of mine. Yeah, thank you so much for the question. Regarding the situation in Sudan, what could be done? So the next level of this discussion is related to the different recommendations. However, from those adaptations mechanisms already adopted by NGOs in Burkina Faso, we could start learning already from them. So the number one is trying to leverage on social media. And as a comment came in from Washington, also boosting LinkedIn profiles. I understand a lot of organizations function on Facebook, but trying to diversify social media access, for example, could be a first approach. Trying to be able to merge. This is not something that I would recommend, but trying to think about these hybrid funding mechanisms, as in like having different funders fund a specific project. I hope that these would be able to help. And as we move forward to discuss the recommendations, maybe there will be much more ideas to tease out in order to be able to support the situation in Sudan. Mabel, I'm over to you.
Thank you very much, Rashad. Joseph, please, you have the floor. Joseph Denuk Beto, please, you have the floor. You can unmute yourself and speak, please.
Je vais parler français, hein. Je ne sais pas si le traducteur peut le faire.
Mais je vous comprends parfaitement.
Ok, merci, c'est gentil.
While with Seth to unmute, we can.
Ok, j'ai vu que le rapport a, disons, présenté la baisse de financement aux ONG et qui, disons, cette baisse de financement fait augmenter, disons, les attaques et autres, la violence. Je voudrais savoir si bon, la baisse là occasionne la pauvreté, puisque si les gens prennent des armes, des conflits, disons, les conflits armés et s'organisent suite à la baisse de financement, ça veut dire que ce financement contribue en quelque sorte, disons, à la réduction de la pauvreté. Pardon. Je voudrais savoir si, disons, le gouvernement n'a pas un mécanisme disons, de suivi des l'activité des ONG pour savoir que quand il y a chute de financement, si, disons, si il ne peut pas suppléer, c'est-à-dire contribuer pour ce financement. Bon, je pense que les pays de l'Afrique de l'Ouest en particulier vivent le problème de manque de financement. Les ONG, je vais parler des ONG. Le Bénin souffre aussi de ces manques de financement. Et je pense au Togo et dans d'autres pays. Mais le cas de Burkina, je vois que c'est spécifique. Bon, comment est-ce que nous pouvons agir? Qu'est-ce que nous pouvons faire pour régler définitivement ce problème et régler définitivement le problème des djihadistes, des conflits armés? Je pense que c'est la question que pose votre rapport. Et je voudrais que nous pensions très sérieusement à régler définitivement ce problème. Merci.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur
Merci.
Joseph.
Rashad, please, let's just take, I think, the other 3 questions so that we can respond at once. Then we move to the next section of the presentation, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So I have Emmanuel, Zobmal, and Frank Sombo. So Emmanuel, please go ahead.
Good morning over here. Sorry, I came in late, and I'm able to, if I can get clearly what you people were discussing, but I saw the topic actually earlier. So because of my office work, I couldn't join at the right time. Yeah, having seen what the topic is and the brief conversation so far, I want to just ask briefly, having known that Burkina Faso is part of the ECOWAS, and with the rejection of the military takeover by some ECOWAS member states, could that be that the reduction in the resource mobilization is possibly affected by the way some African or neighboring countries are perceiving the current regime in Burkina Faso? And what are the efforts in your research in order to de-escalate or be able to prevent escalation of such conflict in Burkina Faso in the neighboring countries? Because I know in a non-actor armed conflict as such, they don't have borders, and they get support from neighboring countries. And in one way or the other, they recruit as well from neighboring countries if possible. So in your research, were you able to factor in these things so that we'll be able to find a clear picture of why such a conflict will be able to persist in a country like that? It's just, I don't know whether my question is in line with what people have discussed so far.
Yeah, yes, Emmanuel, it is. And thank you very much for the question. So, colleagues, please, when you have the floor, kindly just be very direct with the question. Now I see there are so many hands coming up, and we would have to, some of the questions would be responded to in the next session, because in the next session, we'll be looking at the recommendations. So some of your questions will be handled in the recommendation section. So I'll take the last question for this session, and then after the recommendations, we would get into another question and answer session. So please don't go away with your questions, just keep them somewhere. We would come back to these questions after the recommendations. Mr. Frank Sombo, please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mabel, and thank you, Rashad. Great presentation, great work. And thank you for the caveat that more conversations will happen around the recommendations, because I feel much of what I would say is more in relation to that aspect of the research. And so I would like to build on what some of the previous participants have raised, especially what my colleague, my friend Dali Serge mentioned in regard to the learnings. And so I'm most interested in what are the learnings that we can draw from the result of this research, especially as regards other countries in West Africa. And I want to expand it a bit to talk about what kind of models. It could be ambitious to draw a model just from this research, but I also know that there are other pieces of research that we have conducted, for instance, on decolonizing aid and local resource mobilization. So I'm wondering how we put the pieces together and whether there was any effort to look at what kind of model that this kind of research can inspire in instances or in places of armed conflict. How does that affect the structure, the governance model, the fundraising, and the sustainability of civil society organizations? And so, as I mentioned sustainability, I would like to also emphasize on that. It wasn't clear, I mean, from what we have discussed so far, to what extent has there been any effect on the shutting down of organizations because they were not able to harness or mobilize resources to maintain their operations? So what has been the effect of those armed conflict and tensions on sustainability of some of these organizations? So bear with me, I would just like to flag a few of those suggestions. They are more for reflections and learning than they are for actual questions. But if there are any insights, even in the second session, you can please bring them up. And so in relation to that also, I'm wondering regarding the funding pattern, there was a two-layered presentation on international aid versus local fundraising. We understand that at both ends, there have been variations. My question is, in terms of the relative increase of the local fundraising, to what extent has there been an uptake of the local support within the context of the armed conflict as opposed to what we'll normally receive from outside, not necessarily in terms of absolute volumes of funds, but in terms of relative support. And then my final reflection on that is what are we taking away apart from the model and the examples and the learnings, is how then are we suggesting that organizations must respond to issues of conflict? Because I noticed that there was side-by-side, if I can call it so, comparison between humanitarian support versus development-oriented support. Is there a suggestion that organizations focus on development must just stick to that regardless of the context? Or could we also learn that in context of conflict, there needs to be in place some kind of solidarity movement toward places and communities that are hardly affected by the issues? And if there is, how do we harness the solidarity movement without necessarily losing the nature and the structure of the organization? And thinking aloud, I could, for instance, think of networks and coalitions. So if I'm in an organization that is primarily focused on development and I am part of a broader network or coalition that perhaps also has members focused on development, but we realize we have to adjust and be more agile to the issues, could we have some kind of emergency response within the network that then relieve individual organizations from having to completely shift their mandate? I mean, this is the line of thinking and reflection I'm trying to put out here, so that even though we are studying Burkina and the fact that is before us, we do not just stick to that, but we try to see how can we learn from it and then have a more agile and adaptive approach to the issues. Thank you, and sorry if I was a bit long on that. Thank you.
Don't worry, it's cool. Mabel, is it possible that you allow me to respond to all these questions in order to keep them in perspective?
Yeah, sure. Please go
Fantastic.
ahead.
Thank you so much.
It sounded I think Frank just made it sound like shifting mandates is okay currently based on everything that's going on. So now I'm looking at it and thinking that, well, okay, it looks like organizations can shift their mandates to respond to some of these issues. But Rashad, please go ahead.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Related to
I thought you were provoking me, so I'll keep it here. So, Rashad.
Yeah, in relation to the question from Benin, can I switch to French or maybe? Oh,
Yeah, yes, you can. There's interpretation at the
yeah.
bottom, so we can always just switch.
Yeah. Par rapport à la question du Bénin,
il peut aller en anglais, je peux suivre.
fantastic, fantastic. Okay, so
Thank
regarding
you.
the question from Benin, I mean, I think there's a need for a little bit of precision. Actually, what we've noticed is that as armed conflicts are increasing, funding is decreasing. Now, it's really an interesting question because it sets a certain loop, such that would this decrease in funding affect poverty? During the interviews, we've actually realized that during the interview, we've realized that some organizations are no more able to carry out their mandates. So organizations that are, for example, working on community development, school reintegration programs for children, health issues, and etc. They are struggling to continue or to lead their mandate because there is this reduction in terms of funding. So I would say to a certain extent that yes, we have a certain loop that increased funding, increased armed conflict is contributing to this reduction of international funding, and that this reduction could potentially, in the long run, influence or have an effect on poverty. Now, will this steer or will this stimulate further conflict? Because some studies have told us that poverty is one of the factors that contributes to the increment of these armed conflicts. I think this is for other studies, but in terms of conflict, funding, and poverty, we could still have a certain set of correlation as part of this study. Now, related to the question on Emmanuel, has the ECOWAS situation affected the perception of NGOs in Burkina Faso, and has this, in a certain extent, affected the funding stream? I would say we could not fully tell, but there's a bit of, this question is much more related to foreign policy, right? And so this research didn't fully dive into the foreign policy, but during the research and during discussions with key stakeholders in the country, we understand that at some point, the foreign policy situation between Burkina Faso, at some point between Burkina Faso and France, for example, froze funding. The funding did not disappear, but some organizations in Europe or France, for example, froze their funding for some time before releasing the funding or asked other criteria before granting this funding. So I cannot fully tell if there's a correlation with ECOWAS. However, there's a certain correlation when it comes to the foreign policy and France and Europe and the European Union much more broadly. Regarding the question from Frank, in terms of the learning, if yes, we could not fully attribute the context in terms of the effect of armed conflict on international and local funding in Burkina Faso to the situation in Niger and Mali, we could definitely draw insights and key learnings. And if I should tease out key learnings, I would say that first of all, organizations are organizing themselves in terms of coalition. And this touches this bit on the sustainability. Several organizations that used to receive massive funding and who have recorded a reduction of funding are now assembling in order to apply for grants together. So an organization, for example, that works on children education could partner with another organization that is working on humanitarian issues and try to bridge or merge their issues together. So together they can apply for funding. So there is one, this is a key learning. Secondly, although I don't have the data, from the interviews, we recorded that smaller organizations are shutting down because they are losing funding. Since they are in situations where, for example, they carry out projects within areas that are highly affected by the conflict, and that funding is no more coming towards red areas, these organizations are shutting down. So one of the key learning which dovetails into the recommendation is that organizations are also forming bigger coalitions. So aside from these partnership with other organizations that have, aside from these partnership or this hybrid model of organizations who have different mandates, you have smaller organizations that are starting to come together. And of course, in the report, this is highly highlighted. Smaller organizations are now coming together to be able to become stronger, are now complementing each other, and are also supporting each other to a certain extent, although it's a little bit smaller. And to what extent there's the uptake of local resource mobilization? First, we need to understand that, so in Burkina Faso, you have over 2 million internally displaced individuals. The people who are able to make donations are individuals. And these people lose either their job, lose their housing, and lose their means of livelihood. So NGOs in Burkina Faso who depend, for example, on membership fee are affected because the members who should be able to contribute have lost their jobs. And so they cannot contribute. So where we see that local funding has decreased, it's not that the people do not want to, it's because they cannot. So even if you move towards a private sector situation where you have lower and lower private sector organizations supporting NGOs, it's not because they don't want to, it's because they cannot. The conflict situation has affected private organizations funding, individuals' livelihoods and funding, and has displaced communities. So even when you have situations where communities were able to mobilize resources, now they are displaced. They've lost their farms, they've lost their cattle, so they can no more contribute. So I try to point some key learnings before we move into the areas of recommendation. And of course, in the report, there are major key learnings which could be teased out. And then I try to highlight some of the key issues which were underlined in the report, particularly related to the optics. So now in terms of networks, coalitions, and etc., this will be much more discussed within the recommendation. Thank you so much for the question, which I love so much. And if there are more questions, of course, we'll have them later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rashad. Yes, of course, he loves questions. And I'm also very appreciative of the audience for bombarding him with the questions. So we would keep the rest of the questions for the end of the session, and we would move now to the recommendations based on the research. There's some recommendations that Rashad came up with. So he would present to us these recommendations, and I hope that he would also respond to some of the questions that some of us have or some of the doubts that we have. So Rashad, please go ahead.
Yeah, but first I need to stress that, so usually when people do research or policy papers, they make recommendations based on their understanding, their own personal understanding. But in this research, from the design of the survey till the recommendation, I tried as much as possible not to influence the outcome. So the key recommendations are the fruit of discussions with key stakeholders in Burkina Faso. So these are actors who have understood their situations, who know the effects of armed conflict on their work, and who are starting to think about ways through which they could support or through which they could survive. And so the first recommendation is to adopt a paradigm shift and move towards an entrepreneurial mindset. And this is a key recommendation. So some organizations underline that first the donor needs to change their mindsets, that some donors, for example, force them into, for example, renting a car. And we know that usually when projects are being run, donors will say car rental, while buying actually a car would be cheaper than renting a car throughout the whole project cycle. And this situation has created a conflict in the minds of some NGOs in Burkina Faso, because they've started to believe that maybe the donor do not care about them, because they think that if we're able to buy a car, we'd save money from car rental, and even after the project, we can keep the car for our financial sustainability and for our other activities. But donors say, no, you must rent a car. And so the first recommendation, which came very strongly from these NGOs, is that donors must change their mindset and move from the straight-jacketed approach of car rental, of these expenditures and that expenditure, towards an entrepreneurial approach. An NGO told me that they had serious issues with donors because they were able to save money and were threatened by the donor. And so these situations are not really great. And so the donors must change their mindset. The second bit is that the donors should work with the local organizations in planning for financial sustainability. A lot of NGOs told me that they are not recipients of funding or aid, but they are partners with the NGOs. And that now that they are in a difficult situation, they feel that the NGOs have abandoned them. Meanwhile, for the NGOs, they feel like the donors have abandoned them. Meanwhile, for NGOs in Burkina Faso, with vis-a-vis the donor, they are not recipients, and the donor is not a donor, but they are partners. So a key recommendation is that donors and NGOs should work together in planning the financial sustainability of an organization. It should not only be about giving out money for a project, but the donor need to come in as in, one day I would leave this organization in Burkina Faso. And so before leaving this organization, I need to work with them such that they are able to survive independent of my presence. Now, the other key recommendation to NGOs this time. Now, I try to only put 2 recommendations from to international donors and 2 recommendations for NGOs in Burkina Faso. However, if you dive into the report, there are actually more recommendations and quotes from NGOs. So for local NGOs, a key recommendation is actually to be transparent and accountable in managing funding and cultivate trust with donors. And this is very important because some NGOs have still a certain opaque approach in managing their funding, or there are no traceability or accounting procedures which allow the donor to fully trust them. And so some donors actually also do not fully trust the NGO, and so they have these on the ground monitoring and evaluation and etc. So the first approach is that NGOs need to enforce transparency and accountability in their work. And so one NGO actually told me is that when you manage well what you have, that is when others will trust you and bring you more funding. And so this is an important recommendation. Now, the other recommendation is that NGOs must think about creating a consortium and peer mentoring. And this relates again to the question that Frank brought forward.
Good morning.
This is a kind of model that we are observing in Burkina Faso. And this change in model or structure of NGO or the NGO landscape or the CSO landscape is also something that could be learned transposed in other spaces. So NGOs could adopt this consortium system where they come together in applying for funding, or where there's actually a peer mentoring, because bigger organizations and peer coaching, because bigger NGOs in Burkina Faso have gathered massive experience in funding management, in funding mobilization, in building trust, in accountability procedures. And so these bigger organizations can mentor smaller organizations, right, in guiding them, and can also form these sort of networks or coalitions to support each other. So these are 4 key recommendations which I brought forward. However, if you go deeper into the report, you discover some other interesting recommendations, quotes, and case studies. Thank you so much for the attendance. And yes, I'm still open to a much more interactive session. Maybe you should let me know if we have enough time. But yes, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Rashad, for these recommendations. One of the things that struck me most is the fact that if you want to be trusted, you need to, the thing that they say, you need to clean your house before you start expecting other people. Yeah. So how many, when we look at some of these organizations, we're expecting to receive funding, but yet we are not putting in place mechanisms for accountability. We are not even diligent with the funds that we receive. So it makes it difficult for donors to fund us. Because again, nobody wants to put their money where they won't be able to receive feedback on what their money is being spent on. So there's a need for us to prove ourselves trustworthy so that we can be able to receive this funding. And the second one around mentorship, when you mentioned that it's advisable for the organizations that have achieved some level of stability to also handhold and ensure that they mentor some of these young organizations that are coming up. Thank you very much, Rashad, for this presentation. Okay, now we would open the floor again to some contributions and some questions if we have any. Rashad says we should bombard him with questions. So please, let's bombard him with the questions. I remember that some of the questions we had held in the previous section. So now it's time for us to, again, come back to these questions. I see the hands coming up. So I'll start with Amarachi. Please go ahead. Hello, Amarachi. Please, can you unmute yourself? Okay, while waiting for Amarachi, we can move on to Emmanuel. Emmanuel, please go ahead.
Thank you for the opportunity once again. Having heard the recommendations made so far by Rashad, I really want to commend the work done so far. And I wish you have more strength and more time to give us the details. But from the first point you raised concerning the interests of the donor, I feel there's a need that the mindset of the donors should be shifted from just being a donor to result-focused budget planning, in the sense that the collaboration during the budget planning for a project as such to researchers or NGOs should be that the donors should be able to focus on peculiarity of an event. Let's look at the current situation in Burkina Faso. What is the peculiar nature of the conflict in Burkina Faso? And if you're doing your budget planning or your financial planning for a recipient or an organization, let it be that you target what result you want to achieve so that you factor in the peculiarity, so that they will not just stand on what particularly they want to achieve without minding what, let's assume an international donor, maybe from the United States or UK, who are not citizens of Burkina Faso or not from West Africa. They won't be able to know the dynamics of the conflict and how the budget planning will be able to give the desired result. So I feel the NGOs should be able to collaborate effectively with the donors for them to understand the peculiarity of everything in terms of their financial planning. Secondly, I want to also make a comment on the issue of domestic funding to organizations. In Africa, I have come to discover that Africans, basically, we don't value research. And that is why most of the funding for research in conflict or poverty issues are foreign donors. And he discovered that the conflict between the researchers and the policymakers has become very, very pronounced. And in some countries like my country, Nigeria, to the extent that at a point in time, a couple of years ago, the parliament wanted to restrict the amount of or the flow of donors or donations to NGOs or civil society organizations in Nigeria, because they see it as a threat and they will be funded outside the government regulations. So in this context, hello?
Yes.
All right. So in this context, when a country is in conflict, it will be difficult for citizens to look at how they will raise funds because their mind will be tilted towards how the conflict will end.
Yeah.
And and it will be difficult for researchers to actually raise funds locally in order to find the root cause of the problem and offer possible solutions to that. So we can as well plan donations between maybe entrepreneurial. That's one of the areas I'm looking at. NGOs should be looking at as well, being entrepreneurial in how you raise funds and also how you are going to be transparent and accountable to the international donations coming in order to be able to do away with the restrictions we're going to face by African leaders who are actually maybe authors of the conflict that we face. Because of bad leadership, we experience conflict, and you don't expect African leaders who might be the authors of the conflict to fund what will bring solution to the conflict. So these are some of my areas I look at the recommendations if may add value to what you've done so far.
Thank you so
Great.
much.
Great. Thank you so
Thank you.
much, Emmanuel. So we will take 3 more questions. Please, when you have the floor, just 1 minute. Please ask your question or give your contribution in 1 minute so that we can round up. I understand that the conversation is getting very interesting, but we also need to understand that other people have other things to do. So Amarachi, please, can you unmute yourself now? Is it possible? If not, Joseph, please, you have 1 minute. Hello, Joseph. Can you please 1 minute?
Hello. Bon, je voudrais d'abord remercier notre ami qui a présenté, qui a fait la brillante présentation. Les États doivent tout faire, mettre tout en œuvre pour préserver la paix, parce que sans la paix, le développement économique et social est hypothéqué. Nous devons, nous, ONG, nous mettre ensemble pour être plus compétitifs sur le marché de recherche de financement. Merci.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Joseph. Musa Abdul, please, you have 1 minute. Musa, please, can you unmute? If you can't, Tusbila Edward, please go ahead while waiting for Musa to unmute.
J'ai à parler, hein. Ok, bonjour. Merci beaucoup. Je tenais à dire merci, à féliciter à ceux qui ont préparé cette webinaire et féliciter les présentateurs à cette webinaire et qui étaient je suis de Burkina, qui est de la qualité et en tout cas qui est une certaine réalité aussi que nous vivons. Et je crois que je n'ai pas trop de questions à poser parce que il y a un de messieurs qui a parlé. Il faut travailler en partenariat avec les structures de ONG locaux. Ça, c'est important. Il y a des pays déjà qui le font, tels que les Américains, les Pays-Bas, et ils le font déjà. Il faut que si les partenaires viennent dans le pays pour travailler, il faut travailler en partenariat, en collaboration avec les structures qui existent déjà. Voilà. Donc, ça va beaucoup renforcer parce qu'ils savent comment intervenir, comment parler. Celui qui vous parle, et moi, je suis de l'Est, de Burkina, donc je sais de quoi je parle. Est-ce que vous comprenez? Donc, c'est vrai, au niveau de mobilisation de ressources locales, vous savez que c'est un peu difficile parce que ça veut dire quoi? À l'heure actuelle, l'État même cherche des ressources pour combattre, pour libérer le pays. C'est à travers la population que l'État se débat. Et comment les ONG aussi partent aussi vers la population aussi. Donc, il y a un peu de difficulté pour la mobilisation de ressources locales. Donc, tout partenaire qui vient pour nous aider, au moins pour aider vraiment la population, est la bienvenue. Mais il faut avoir la manière aussi de venir, de la manière et le respect aussi des pays, le respect aussi de nos gouvernants, et pour faciliter aussi la mise en œuvre de ces activités. Je ne serai pas long. Je tiens à vous dire merci. Voilà, merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much. Please, my colleague would be sharing a link in the chat section. We would like to continue this conversation some other time, and we would be very interested in knowing what your feedback is regarding this session. If there are some points you would want us to consider while organizing the next session, please indicate them in the link my colleague would be sharing in the chat section. I understand that there's still so much that we want to talk about. I see so many hands are raised, but it's rather unfortunate that we would have to come to the end of this session. It looks like the issues around armed conflicts and funding have touched so many people at the very core. We would look at how we can organize more sessions like this in the upcoming months so that we can get to at least get more experiences and more opportunities for sharing and documenting some of these experiences that we are capturing here today. On behalf of the entire WAXI staff, I would like to first of all appreciate Rashad for this very insightful report that he has presented today. I think it has really been an eye-opener to many of us. And I understand that, like we mentioned, some of these contexts are unique in their own way, but there are some points that we can leverage on. There are some issues that cut across, issues around leveraging social media, issues around forming alliances and building like networking. I think these are some of the issues that we can pick up from this presentation. So thank you very much, the communications team, for the unwavering support, and to you, those of you who took out time from your very busy schedule to take part in this session. We are so grateful. We are only here because of you. If you were not here today, we wouldn't be seated here. So thank you so much. Please don't forget to fill out the form that has been shared in the chat section. We would like to get your information so that at the end of the day, we can also share the recording as well as the presentation. There's been a lot of requests on this. So thank you again once more, colleagues, and enjoy the rest of the day and have a very great weekend ahead. Looking forward to meeting you again in the next session. It's been amazing having you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mabel, and thank you to everyone for your participation. Most of all, thank you to all those who responded to the survey and to who participated in the interviews. Thank you to also the key actors who helped us test the survey, who were available to provide all necessary information on the ground. I'm extremely grateful. And thank you so much for the questions. And yes, I'm definitely sure that once you read the report, you are going to capture a lot more insights. And thank you to WAXI for the opportunity, for the webinar, and for everything done to coordinate this work, this research, and for the investment in research. Thank you so much. On this, I would say bye-bye to everyone. Let's keep up the good work. And yes, hopefully there'll be change in Africa, there'll be development in Africa, and will improve the lives of people. Thank you.
Please, the report link has been shared again in the chat section. For those of us who are not able to access it, you can access it and share with us your comments. We would like to know, what do you think about the report? What are some of the other areas we can still look at based on what we've had as discussions today? It'll be really interesting to know some of those things we should look out for. Thank you very much, guys. Enjoy the rest of